we want to make small teams feel like big teams. There's too much of the discussion right now that talks about making big teams feel like smaller teams. But actually, if we think about the net new insights that you can get through this particular technology, you can actually build scale and make teams much more scaled as a result of it.
HR has evolved, and quickly. What began as a simple process of managing employees now focuses on retention, upskilling, efficiencies, and augmenting capabilities across the board. At IBM, we put our money where our mouth is in terms of technology we build, using it internally first before offering it to our clients. The ways we've incorporated agentic AI into our own enterprise, especially in HR, is a fascinating case study. Today, I'm very lucky to be joined by Steve Moss, Director watsonx Americas at IBM, to talk HR, agentic AI, and the proof is in the pudding, power of IBM's Client Zero story.
David, great to be with you today.
So you started in HR, right?
Yeah, so previously was in our HR team, in fact, worked in there for 10 years. Most recently, over the last couple of months or so, I moved over to our go-to-market team. I realized I was speaking so much around the transformation and the work that we've done internally, and specifically how my career had been changed, that it was now valuable to our clients, and then to talk to them about how specifically they can see the same transformation. So yeah, it's been a great career move so far.
It's not bad. So let's talk about the fun things about HR. What was the most frustrating day-to-day you faced every day?
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine in a support function and a growth enabler, that's a question that comes up quite heavily. I'd organize it into two specific personas, right? So when you think about the role of HR is to support the organization, very quickly, employees and managers become very much a part of your day-to-day world. So one of the things that I have often found was I'd be getting people coming to me and saying, hey, Steve, can you just help me out with this particular challenge that I have? I don't want to navigate all these different systems, all this different data. How can I get to where I need to be as quick as possible? Now, what does that do? It then influences the second persona, which is the HR professional themselves, right? Then it becomes my role to help them navigate through those different complex systems and architectures just to get what they need. And if you think about some of the frustrating things that encourages, right? People then not getting the right help and support and the speed in which they need it, all these disparate ways in which they could. And then they're asking me specifically as the frontline to the HR team, hey, how can I get some of these queries and questions answered? And so I often joke that when I used to sit in my college days and hear about strategic HR and how we should have a voice at the table to talk about specific things like workforce management, etc., I wasn't spending my time on that. In fact, probably 75% of the time, I was just helping people get transactional work done. And so that really needed to change. And we started to look at that specifically for our function inside the business as well.
Did you ever dream that you can come up with a solution for these frustrations for something like IBM? IBM has how many, like 250,000 employees in how many countries? Like 170 countries?
Yeah, right.
Did you ever imagine that you could actually come up with a solution for something like this?
Well, what was interesting is as we all started to work with AI, and to specifically IBM has been in this particular space for a number of years. When I joined straight out of college, we were starting to discuss inside the function, how can we specifically start to then leverage technology to work on new strategic work as a result of that, right? So very quickly and very early on, I found myself actually working on what was IBM Cloud at the time and playing around with some of our AI capability. So I remember I was actually interviewing for a position inside of our HR function, and I needed to make myself look very different. And one of the ways in which I did that, I actually hard-coded my own chatbot to be an AI resume, essentially, to actually answer questions on me and specifically some of the skill sets that I had.
You really did that?
Yeah.
Oh, dude, so I can get a promotion potentially by making an own chatbot about...
I'm from HR, I'm not going to make comments like that.
You got to tell me.
But the point was this, right? It was, look, we need to be able to make sure we scale as individuals, right? A lot is made in the age of generative AI that it's going to be a replacement for us. And that there's a lot of discussion in the media about people now thinking and learning about how can I use this technology because I think it's going to replace me. Well, actually, my perspective is a little bit different as we think about something like an AI resume, which is I'm not going to be in every one of these conversations. And in fact, maybe I don't need to be in 6 different interviews. If someone can ask a question to an AI model and get questions and answers back from it, right? So that was the first experimentation that I absolutely had as we started to think about bringing it into the function. Now, to your point and to your question, what is IBM doing now, specifically in the HR space? Well, across those 250,000 employees in 170 countries, we now have a front-end AI model that answers questions, but also helps them to transact across a number of different HR systems so that they have one place to go. Now, you and I were speaking offline, David. You're an avid user of it, so maybe we could talk about some of the ways in which you've been able to use that to help alleviate some of the problems we spoke about at the start, right?
No, for sure. I mean, like anything I need to know about my taxes, I mean, it just sends me to the right place. I go to Workday, I ask any question to this thing, and I know I'm selling it for IBM, but it really is a game changer. Just the way, you were able to transfer some of the stuff you learned from SKHR to other parts of internally for other parts of our company, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So look, one of the things that we've done is we've started to bring our employees with us on this journey is we have a hackathon every single year. We call it the What's Next Challenge. I know you've done it for the last 2 years. And
I won it once.
And the best thing about it is, look, we've got a number of different ideas that come up in our day-to-day about how you can bring your employees with you to then be more productive in the work that they do. So one of the best stats that I like to bring up as we start to think about a challenge like that is 70% of our employees, after they go through that 2-week period of just playing around with the technology, they actually put their ideas into production. Now, I raise this because I actually hired somebody who won the challenge last year. So it seems like I'm in a esteemed company, both with you and him, who specifically was looking at a sales use case. Now, again, as I said, I've moved over to our go-to-market teams. There's a couple of things I've realized since becoming a sales leader is this. One is it's really important that you have good connection with your client, that you build relationships. The second is how do you know about our products and how they work? But most importantly, in the sales domain, and you'll probably tell me the same, it's an admin function. It's really important to get follow-ups going correctly, to talk to the right people, to talk to them at the right time and catch them in the moment. And this particular individual on my team who we brought in, he did a use case specifically around a sales assistant. So we took the same types of technology we did in the HR space around unifying systems and data and information, AI assistants and now agents. And you can actually have a conversation with a model that can then give you, for example, suggested prospecting information or how to connect things like Salesforce and Salesloft and Seismic and other different back-end systems. So now as an HR function, we've been able to translate that to things like sales and IT and procurement and other back-end systems, because ultimately it's about employee productivity and how we can make sure our teams are spending less time in those different systems and now in front of our customers and generating value as well.
Well, it's interesting that you also brought up that to get your job that you had now, you went into our technology and built it yourself. So a lot of this sounds like using our own internal tools is just a part of what we do at IBM anyway. And so it actually helped promote like what we were using with AskHR. So human resources contains the word human, right? How is this agentic AI actually helping HR professionals in particular and people like me who use it?
So again, if we think back to those two personas, really it's enabling both the HR professional to do the more increased activity in terms of strategy as opposed to then sitting there and doing some of the manual work. So I'll give you a good example back from my heyday, if you like. So when I was an HR partner and I was in our consulting business, we run an annual process that really looks at how to promote a number of individuals at one time. So previously, without the help of AI and automation, I was essentially the human glue in the middle of that process. So what would I do, right? I would go to our HRIS system and I would get the list of people who potentially might be promoted. I would work with my leaders to work down on the list and then looking at the different criteria to make that list smaller. And then I'd go back to the HRIS system and I would upload it myself. Now, what can we do with AI assistants and agents? Well, we can give them a level of agency to make those calls out to those back-end systems, but also make suggestions and recommendations to managers on who they might potentially want to promote and have that dialogue back and forth. So you ask the question, well, what does that do for the HR professional, right? Does that mean that there is no HR professional in that process any longer? Well, no, they actually become more human in that process and that they get to speak more with the managers, to coach them, to guide them on through that discussion. And they also look at the overall program and to watch how we're then deploying it as opposed to being stuck in the weeds of the more transactional tasks.
Yeah, I instantly, when you started saying like giving agency to an application to do these kinds of things, there's obviously a couple of pitfalls there, and having the human in the loop, especially in case of promotion, stuff like that, I imagine was very important to the process that you were coming up with.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we care very much about at IBM, both in our HR teams, but also as we've looked across different growth enabler functions, is there's absolutely a sliding scale of agency or autonomy. You could look at it that way. So there's a lot of folks in the market today, and specifically as we stand here, as we launch our own agents at IBM, that are questioning, well, do I give everything over to the model and do I allow it to have that level of agency, or do I just resolve it or resign it to certain aspects and tasks? Well, specifically at IBM, we care about a combination of those things.
Definitely.
Right. You can use an agent specifically to pass out and understand itself what tools it's going to use to answer a question or to complete a process. Or you could say inside of one of the specific domains like HR, you can use it to connect into more traditional AI and automation and use it as a combination of tools. So what we're really seeing as value is that combination of those different technologies. We don't think the answer is to give everything over to agency. If you do, then we're in a bit of a challenging state. So you need to combine it with traditional tools, traditional automation, and to use it at the right time. And one of the things we talk about in IBM is just because you can with this technology doesn't mean that you should. So we've been really thoughtful, specifically in the HR space, that certain things we're going to use very traditional AI and automation. But other things, right? You think about things like career and skills and other parts of the employee experience where we want it to be a bit more creative. We can use agents to invoke that level of traditional or more generative AI, and therefore we give them a set of tools to answer the right thing at the right time and more productively as well.
It becomes a problem for engineers in particular. First of all, we want to automate everything. Everything has to be automated. And also, anytime a new fancy tool like agentic AI comes out, we're saying everything is now the nail to this agentic AI hammer. So that's something that you have to, I imagine, straddle when you're doing this. And using like traditional AI and traditional machine learning to do a lot of this stuff, it seems like obviously the way to go. So when you were building Ask HR, when it first existed, it wasn't as good as it is now. I can tell you from personally, but what was that process and how did we end up to where we have it today?
I remember being a HR partner at the time and having to ask my managers to go and use this particular tool pretty actively. And look, we took a decision many, many years ago to say that we would turn off things like the phones and the emails, etc. And we would really try and force that change. And again, as an HR partner at the time, some of the questions that I had from some of my managers and leaders were, well, is this really fit for purpose? Is it going to give me the level of service that you can provide me as somebody who's going to pick up the phone and answer my question? And one of the things we really had to stay the course with our HR team specifically on was, look, if you can then start to force this change and start to have people use this, then the advocacy starts to build. So I often think in the AI agents and AI assistant space, this really is a currency of advocacy, right? If you don't have people using the model, helping it to learn, to change, et cetera, and then to implement it in their day-to-day roles, then they're not going to see real tangible value from it. So I think there's an element of this too, which is as teams and different organizations embark on this journey, specifically in HR, but you can also apply this to procurement and IT and others different units, et cetera. You also need to bring your teams with you as well, right? So we've done a couple of things specifically in the HR team that's helped us to really shape this change. Number one is recognition of our teams. People that have really encouraged that change and they've embodied it and they've embraced it, then we really stand them up in front of others and we say, these are folks that are embracing the change and they're using it to make their jobs more efficient and productive. And the other piece of this is really things like performance management, having discussions around, hey, well, look, and I was very much a factor of this too, you going and opening a ticket, for example, or asking the bot, for example, the question and answer and then handing it to the manager is not a good example of you embodying that change, right? And I had a number of people reach out to me because we were looking at dashboards and things to say I was doing that many, many times. The best thing then to do was to encourage our leaders to go and use it themselves, because self-service means we can increase the feedback and then the way that we make this work. So yeah, a couple of different things there I'd say in terms of how we've helped both our HR teams to adopt this, but also with our managers and employees as well.
So from where Ask HR was to where it is today, there's been a change internally, I imagine, where initially you had a ton of deterministic actions that, you're going in and this is the route you're going to take. Now using this multi-agent approach is creating new capabilities and iterating on old ones still possible. And can I see under the hood a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk a little bit technical now. So absolutely. Previously with AI assistants, they've been very programmatic. And I know we've had a number of IBM speakers talk about this. I'm going to use my own example of the difference between an assistant and an agent. And you can hear as a Brit, I'm a very big English soccer fan. So I'm going to use an example from that stage. So if I think about my favorite soccer star, he's got an assistant and he's got an agent. Now, what's the difference between those two particular sets of technology if we think about it that way, right? In his example, he is giving some inputs to the assistant to make a dinner reservation, for example. So there's a back and forth conversation that needs some input from the soccer star in order to determine where they're going to go for dinner, for example, in that particular space. Now, the other piece is the agent that they have as part of their team. And the conversation then becomes, well, how does that person then take agency to go and speak to a club owner about how they might want to move to a new club, for example? So these two things are working absolutely together to be really helpful to the individual, and specifically in our case, the employee, the manager, and sometimes the customer. Now, you wanted to look under the hood. So firstly, at any which point, we have a very strong perspective at IBM that says that ethics and the ability to look into the model at any point is very, very important. And that doesn't escape from the HR realm either. Really important. So when you're dealing with things like SPI, PII, etc., you need to be able to at any point And from a model perspective, respond to where data is being used and where it isn't being used as well. If we start to think about mission critical things in the HR space, you're now doing things like employment verification letters, salary increases, moves of employees from A to B. At any which point, we need to be able to look inside that quote unquote black box and say where data is moving from A to B. So really important. Now, from a technical lens on the agent side, we've been able to expose this in a no and low code way. Really simple, because we believe very heavily that the users of this particular technology also has to be the domain professional. Often we joke at IBM that it's actually easier to take HR people and make them technologists than technologists and make them HR people. And really important then if we use that technology to essentially build almost building blocks as part of a process. A good example of this is how do you transfer an employee from A to B, right? So we hire and we change our employees' organizations probably around 80,000 times every single year at the company. And that involves a step change from the HRIS from one manager to the other. How do you do that from an agent perspective now? Well, it's very simple. The agent will go out and it will use a series of tools to make that change happen. It'll call out to an underlying HRIS system. That's one tool. Then it might say, okay, I'm going to create an email between one manager to the other. That's another tool. And then for example, it's going to send that email to the new manager to say, I've just moved, for example, David to Steve. So we're now using these collections of skill flows is the way that we call it, to add different tools together and to action transactions for our employees and managers at ease as well. And it's all being done by an AI agent that's deciding on which tool to use at the right time as well.
And it's really interesting when you talk, so the low code thing and having people who are not necessarily technologists using this application. I had a customer where we would talk about because they have an entire chatbot on their front end that they use. I'm like, what's the process if you want to add a route? You want to add, and I'm like, how long does that usually take? He's like, first we have to send it to our engineers who are going to build it out. Then we look at it and say if it's okay. And then we have this process of probably like 2-3 weeks just for one additional route to even be functional. And that was one of the selling points. I'm like, why don't you look at this UI? You can make the change like directly into the action. You can see it instantly. And it's just, I'm a big fan of it, even though I am a technologist and I do like getting deep. But seeing the new, especially with the new agent framework is just very, very cool.
And we started this conversation speaking around this concept of client zero for IBM, right? So this idea that we as a 250,000 strong organization are going to test our technology first. We've also productized it, right? We've done something really smart that says, look, we're going to be the first people to test this, to build this, and then to get the output and the outcomes from it. But we're also going to make sure that you don't spend years and years also then building it yourself. So the same technology that we've used on ourselves that we can then provide as accelerators and templates is exactly what we're doing with this multi-agent model. But if you take, for example, a set of tools that we've used on our own business, and you can then create it as a template so that, organizations can pick it up and they can customize it to themselves, they can get there 70% quicker than if they were to start themselves and to bring all these different platforms and these different technologies together. So we've gone first, but we've also put it into our products so that our teams and our products and our organizations we work with can also see that as an accelerator too.
The skills actually can connect not automatically, but you have like templates for them to connect to a ton of different third-party sources.
Absolutely. So we've started in HR, which is launched today. We also then are moving very quickly through things like procurement and sales, because absolutely we've seen that great success and those outcomes for our own business internally. But most importantly is how can then our customers then pick that up and very quickly do their own quick customization and start to see the value that we have as well. I think that's the number one thing for 2025. There's two words here, right? Number one is agents, and we're hearing it a lot. But secondly is how do I actually get real tangible value out of this? Or you work with IBM because we've done it to ourselves and we've been able to give you a platform.
So we have a tremendous organization, a ton of people, a lot of work. I would imagine that you're using a very large model, which then has its own budget constraints and energy consumption. Am I right or wrong about this?
You're wrong in that. Sorry, David. One of the things that we've done to kind of fuel the agentic AI that we have in those different domains is also then to put a smaller model behind it. And it's really important to us. Again, we've spoken about the DeepSeek phenomenon that happened over the last couple of weeks. We were really excited because it actually affirmed a lot of the work that we've been doing with watsonx for many years, right? So the concept is simple. You take a smaller model, you do prompting and tuning on it, and it's specifically then deployed for that particular task and that use case. So if you think about that in the HR domain, there's two particular models that we're using in combination together to make those tasks and transactions happen. One is with the supervisory agent. Right. So the employee goes in and they just have a problem or a question. They want to get from A to B. They don't care about the underlying system. They just have a challenge that they want to solve. So they'll put in there a question like, hey, How do I generate an employment verification letter, for example? And then that supervisory agent is going to use a small model to then go and fuel that task and those particular tools to go and fix that challenge for them and to answer and to transact on their behalf. However, you also need then inside the domain a series of smaller domains that are HR specific, because very clearly I don't want a large model with a lot of data sets and multiple parameters. In fact, a ton of parameters answering from a legal, for example, set of information that is being provided in an HR domain or IT for HR, etc. We don't want those hallucinations to happen. So we firmly believe in smaller models that are tuned and specifically deployed for those different domains coming together, and that multi-agent then being able to use those different models and also those tools to go and transact and to help the individual employee.
So we could in one flow have multiple different models doing multiple different tasks.
Yeah, and we believe in multi-model and multimodal as well. So it's absolutely a factor of the way that we're looking at this for sure.
So a lot of enterprise, a lot of big companies, they just have a ton of data, right? And they're maybe hesitant to start this journey just because we have to curate our data, we have to do something. Is that a valid concern?
Yeah. I mean, look, we look at this in a multitude of ways. Fundamentally, we believe that getting data right is absolutely a marathon, and it needs to be something we look at over time. Right? But we also believe that marathon is made up of a ton of very small sprints. And what I mean by that specifically is, look, good quality data and good quality AI go hand in hand. Right? There's this concept of you can't have good AI without good quality IA. But it doesn't mean to say that the people that are listening to this podcast today should then be sitting there for the next 10 years and not doing anything with AI while they wait for their data to be correct. So what we often advocate for as we speak to our customers is, hey, let's go and start on some very small use cases. Let's start to see where that data potentially is incorrect or we need to work on it to change it. But let's make sure we're starting to get the output from generative AI from day one with a small use case that we can then grow and scale. Great example of this is I used to be a compensation professional inside of our function. So I was working on things like ensuring our teams were paid correctly and on time and a number of different things that relate to people getting paid. And we previously worked on a model where we took 40 different inputs to give managers a suggestion of how David should be paid during our employee salary cycle. When we first started that in around 2017, the uptick of that was about 40%. So managers didn't agree with it 60% of the time. And the feedback that we got was some of the data that was being put into the system wasn't necessarily correct. However, now, as we sit here today in 2025, 95% of the time managers agree with that particular model and they're giving suggestions, it's giving suggestions to our managers as they go and then complete their salary planning. So the point of that is start small on something, let's iterate on the data and then let's build it and scale it over time, but just get started because otherwise if you're waiting for 100%, you're never going to get going.
So the data that you use for this compensation tool, did it change or was it more refined from the existing data?
Exactly, refined. Yeah, prompting, tuning, making sure that we have the right inputs. What's quite interesting is you think about things like data lineage and data cleanliness. When you start putting those into models, very quickly the model is just going to feed out what it's been given. And so the concept here is it's only as good as what has been put into the system. So what that allows you to see very quickly is if the model is starting to misbehave or there's some wrong inputs inside of it, we can very quickly get in and clean it up because now we have visibility to it, as opposed to before where it's just sitting in disparate places and we weren't doing anything about it.
If you're listening to this, if someone's listening to this right now and they're kind of on the fence of bringing in agentic AI, when do the costs make sense?
I think number one is we should absolutely be having a conversation around return on investment anytime we're considering AI now, right? I think a lot of these organizations that we've worked with and specifically out there in the media have tried that particular process, which is they've gone to the whiteboard, they've understood the capability of generative AI. They've done the sticky board exercise to say, here's the 5 or 6 things we're going to use this for, but they haven't actually gone into production. And one of the major reasons for that is because they've not thought through the lens of return on investment and scale. Very quickly, you start thinking about, okay, well, how do I then take a process like in the HR space? And how can I do things like reduce costs? How can I reduce technical debt? How can I then send the productivity that the employees and the managers previously were spending through passing through different systems and data and now reinvesting their time somewhere else? So one of the ways that we do this is we start to think about it through the context of value and ROI. I actually do this to my own work actually pretty actively right now, which is I take a step back and I say, okay, what have I worked on in the last week? How much time have I allocated to a certain specific set of tasks? And how can we refocus that by then doing things like having conversations like, well, what can I automate today? And now how can I focus on different work as a result of it? So I think in the age of generative AI and now specifically in the world of agents, one of the things we have to be really thoughtful as we we think about ROI is how much time are we spending on particular tasks that we actually don't want to be delivering that are highly manual, and how can we now think about reinvesting our time and efforts somewhere else? And we do that at scale all the time, and we call it our value methodology at IBM.
So those manual processes, manual tests, the tedium that exists in practically every job, I don't think people talk enough about when you get rid of that tedium. You're opening up the door for your engineers, for anyone who's working, to actually not just breathe, but have more like ability to do other things that will bring that return. Is that calculated in the return on investment when you talk about it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we kind of call that cost avoidance, and the aspect of that is productivity. So the way I think about this is very, very simple. We want to make small teams feel like big teams. There's too much of the discussion right now that talks about making big teams feel like smaller teams. But actually, if we think about the net new insights that you can get through this particular technology, you can actually build scale and make teams you're much more scaled as a result of it. So a good example of this at IBM, and we had a small team that were specifically working on learning class management. So their role was to essentially watch when we had one class open with 5 people and one class open with 2 people, but the actual class could take 7 people. So they were actually specifically working on how do you then invite these 2 people to go to that other team's learning class, and how do we then make that full, and how do we then cancel that other class, etc. All of that work there is just busy work. It's just moving one hand to the other. And what we're able to do was to use agents then to actually outsource a lot of that work. So the learning class manager is now spending time on the best quality content to deliver in the session and not moving one hand to the other.
We're both technologists. We're both in this field. Has anything happened in AI recently that's just taken you completely by surprise?
Specifically, as we start to think about this craze around smaller models, right? There's this big concept now that very quickly we don't need to think about these large language models that then use the whole internet to answer specific questions. And that really excites me, because now I believe after the initial hype that we've been in, we're actually going to start thinking about scaling it and taking it to new use cases and to driving success and change. I think we were very much locked up in this concept of asking very, very big models, very small questions. And now what we're able to do is to actually flip that on its head, to say, let's ask smaller models very big questions and let's see how we can scale them as well. So I was very excited to see a lot of the work that we have been doing specifically around smaller models. That's one side.
Then that changed with DeepSeek. Like I'm imagining, like the second that came out, everyone's like, we could do this on how much training and all that stuff. So that definitely changed the whole.
Yeah, because if you think about how you apply this to the fuel of the agentic model, right? How do you move, for example, an employee from A to B? Previously, that was a question of how do you then look into a very, very large language model, and how do you use up energy and how do you use up tokens to do something that's very, very small? What's really exciting now, and it validated what we've been doing at IBM, is how can you then do that at scale, but then at a fraction of the cost, a fraction of the energy, so you can now move on to bigger and better things. So it's been really quite exciting to see that evolve over time.
Have you noticed that in parallel with like the budget savings and the energy savings, that accuracy has gotten better with small models?
Absolutely. So they're the 2 drivers as we think about ROI, right? What's the accuracy? How is it increasing? But also then how are you doing it at a fraction of the cost? Specifically at IBM, we have a family of models that are enterprise grade models, specifically called Granite. And we did a market benchmark study that looked at other models and other model providers. And the majority of the time, in fact, 90% of the time, they were actually a lot less costly, but they were more performant as a result of it. And it's all because we can make these smaller models a lot more tuned and trained specifically on that very specific data set and task. And it allows us then to grow and scale that as much as possible.
All right, Steve, last advice. How do people get started?
Yeah, I think there's really 2 ways in which we can think about this, and they actually come together pretty concurrently. Firstly, when we speak to our clients and we say to them, hey, how do you move from this great conversation that we've had around IBM's Client Zero mission and our particular technologies and what's next? They say to us, okay, great, what's next? And what we say to them is twofold. One is find some use cases with our help in which we're going to be able to scale these very, very quickly. So it could be a small set of use cases where the most pain is coming out and how we can then use that to refactor the work to make sure your teams are doing better quality work as a result of it as well. So that's one side of it. The other thing is, let's have a conversation. So start talking to me about specifically what are some of the aspects that you're looking at to drive and some of those outcomes you're looking for specifically this year, and how can we turn that into an ROI-based conversation? Is it that you're trying to reduce costs? Is it that you're trying to make your smaller teams feel like bigger teams, etc.? What are the goals that you have? And we can align those to use cases to make sure that we are then ultimately delivering true and tangible value for you as well as you think about agents.
Steve, this has really been great. I really appreciate the time you spent with me today, and genuinely, and I'm being very serious, I genuinely appreciate Ask HR. It has made my life much easier. To everyone listening, thank you so much for being here. Stay tuned to YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you watch or listen for more insights. into how to put AI into action in your workflow. See you soon.